The Tunnel of Whispers. I've been hauling freight for almost 15 years, but before I hit the open road, I was a mechanic in a tiny garage outside of Knoxville. It wasn't glamorous, but I could fix just about anything that had an engine and four wheels. Funny enough, I was always the guy they called when the tow truck broke down, which is how I ended up behind the wheel of a rig. One day, I got so sick of fixing other people's problems that I figured I might as well make some money driving myself. My buddies at the shop didn't believe I'd last a month. But here I am, over 1,000,000 miles later. Guess I showed them. Most days, the road is peaceful. There's a sort of rhythm to it, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the drone of the engine, the miles slipping by under an endless sky. But every now and then, something happens that shakes you to your core, and you never forget it. One night, in the Cumberland Gap Tunnel, I found out just how unsettling the road could be. Now, I'd heard plenty of strange stories about the Cumberland Gap Tunnel, which runs between Kentucky and Tennessee. Truckers talk. Some said it was haunted, others said it was cursed because they built the thing over an old burial ground. I didn't buy into that stuff. I'd driven through it 100 times, and the worst thing I ever encountered was bad traffic or the occasional tailgater. But this night was different. I was coming down from Lexington, Kentucky, heading into Tennessee with a load of farm equipment. It had been raining for hours, one of those steady downpours that doesn't let up, the kind that soaks you to the bone even if you're only outside for a few seconds. The wipers were doing their best to keep up, but the rain was coming down so hard it was like driving through a waterfall. Visibility was shot. I could already feel the tension in my shoulders, the kind you get from gripping the wheel too tight for too long. I figured once I got through the tunnel, the weather might clear up. Maybe I could catch a couple hours of shut-eye at a rest stop before pushing on to Knoxville. But as soon as I hit the entrance to the Cumberland Gap Tunnel, something felt off. First, my radio cut out. Just a burst of static, and then nothing. Now, I like to listen to the oldies while I drive. Nothing keeps you awake like belting out some Johnny Cash when the miles start to blur together. But when the music stopped, all I had left was the sound of the rain pounding against the windshield and the occasional rumble from the tires on the slick road. Then, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind. You know how it is, sometimes the wind rushes through your mirrors just right and makes a kind of whistling noise. But this was different. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. No, not just one, a whole mess of voices, faint at first, like they were far away. I told myself I was hearing things, maybe the rain messing with my head, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. The voices were inside the cab. I glanced around, but of course, there was no one else in the truck. I was alone, or at least, I was supposed to be. The whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like a dozen people all talking at once, overlapping, like they were trying to get my attention but couldn't quite manage it. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I've always been a calm guy, the kind of person who laughs in the face of a flat tire on a rainy day. But this had me spooked. Then, just as the voices reached their peak, something even worse happened. My truck began to slow down, on its own. My foot was pressed down on the gas, but it was like the rig had a mind of its own. I was doing 60, but suddenly I was barely hitting 40, then 30. I mashed the pedal to the floor, but the engine didn't respond. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding me, filling the cab like a chorus of ghosts. It was overwhelming, suffocating. I panicked, which is something I never do. But it felt like whatever was in that tunnel wanted to stop me, to keep me there with it. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone, or something, sitting in the back seat of the cab. Every hair on my neck was standing on end. My mind raced. Maybe the brakes were jammed. Maybe the engine was stalling. But deep down, I knew something else was at play. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The truck jerked forward, like someone had flipped a switch. The whispers vanished, and the engine roared back to life. I shot out of that tunnel like a bat out of hell, my heart racing in my chest. When I finally saw the end of the tunnel and the rain-soaked landscape of Tennessee beyond, it was like coming up for air after being trapped underwater. I pulled over at the first rest area I could find, parked my rig, and sat there in silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. At the rest stop, I ran into another trucker I'd seen a few times on the road. Big guy, always wore a baseball cap with some old trucking company's logo on it. I figured maybe he'd experienced something similar. Drivers tend to know these things, even if we don't talk about it much. After a few minutes of small talk, I told him what had happened in the tunnel. He raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair. The whispers, huh? He said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, I've heard about that. They say the tunnel's built over some old burial ground. Indian, I think. Or maybe soldiers. I can't remember. But people say that at night, the spirits, they get restless. Sometimes they hitch a ride. I laughed, but it came out shaky. Restless spirits, huh? Is that what they call it when your truck decides to stop on its own? He shrugged. Could be. Or maybe it's just the wind. But I've heard the stories. Drivers hearing whispers, feeling like they're being watched. You ain't the first, and you won't be the last. I finished my coffee, trying to shake off the lingering unease. I've had weird things happen on the road before, strange lights in the sky, odd people in truck stops, but nothing like that. And to this day, I don't know what really happened in that tunnel. Was it the spirits of the dead, trapped beneath the earth? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me, worn out from too many hours behind the wheel? Either way, I make it a point to avoid the Cumberland Gap Tunnel at night. Because whether it's ghosts or just some bad vibes, I'm not taking any more chances. Let the whispers stay where they belong, in the past, buried beneath the ground. The vanishing convoy on Route 666. I've been a trucker for 12 years now, and I thought I'd seen it all: bad weather, narrow escapes, bizarre roadside encounters, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night on US Route 491, the stretch formerly known as Route 666. There's a reason locals called it the Devil's Highway before they changed the number. Maybe it was to ward off bad luck, or maybe just to put people's minds at ease. But in those dark, empty stretches of desert, the history of the road clings to you like a shadow. I was heading south out of Durango, Colorado, aiming to hit Gallup, New Mexico, by dawn. It was one of those nights where everything feels a little off. The moon was nowhere to be seen, and the stars barely punctured the thick blanket of black sky. It was the kind of dark that made you feel like the universe had swallowed you whole, leaving only the yellow beams of your headlights cutting a narrow path through the void. The highway was practically deserted, with nothing but flat desert on either side. My radio was crackling with static, so I turned it off, letting the hum of my engine fill the silence. Time seemed to stretch out, the road stretching endlessly before me. Then, in my side mirror, I caught sight of headlights, several of them. At first, it was a relief. Out here, with nothing but desert and mountains for miles, seeing another vehicle felt like a reminder that you weren't alone in the world. But as the lights drew closer, something felt wrong. They were too bright, too close, and too many. I figured it must be a convoy, other truckers heading in the same direction. No big deal, right? Convoys are common, especially at night when everyone's trying to cover ground. But the longer I drove, the stranger it got. The trucks were moving in perfect sync. Not a single one lagged behind, no one sped up or drifted out of line. It was eerie, like they were tethered together by some invisible force, moving as one. The headlights were so bright that they cast long shadows ahead of me, making my skin prickle with unease. After 20 minutes of this, I decided to pull over at the next rest stop. There was no way I could keep driving with that blinding light in my mirrors. The exit came up, and I signaled, pulling off the highway. I expected the convoy to pass me as I slowed down, but when I glanced back over my shoulder, they were gone. I mean, just gone. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd missed them or they'd turned off without me noticing, but the highway behind me was completely empty. I pulled into the small rest stop, nothing more than a grimy parking lot and an old diner with a few flickering neon signs. My hands were shaking, and I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that the long hours on the road were messing with my head. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. How could an entire convoy just vanish without a trace? I got out of my truck, the cool desert air hitting my face, and stood by my rig for a moment, scanning the highway behind me. No headlights, no taillights. No sign of them at all. The silence of the desert was oppressive, like the whole world was holding its breath. I made my way inside the diner, hoping a cup of coffee would shake off the weirdness. The place was nearly empty, just a few other truckers hunched over their meals and a tired-looking waitress behind the counter. I slid into a booth near the window, still keeping an eye on the highway. The waitress shuffled over, her face lined with years of fatigue. "What can I get ya, hun?" she asked, her voice raspy, like she'd been smoking for decades. "Just coffee," I muttered, still distracted, my mind replaying the sight of those trucks, the way they'd disappeared without a trace. As she poured the coffee, I couldn't help but blurt out, "You ever see any strange convoys on this stretch of road? Trucks that move together, all in sync." Her hand paused mid-pour, and for the first time, she really looked at me. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see something flicker behind her tired expression, something like recognition. "You saw, didn't you?" she said quietly, her voice low. "The convoy of the dead." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" She slid into the booth across from me, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "Folks around here don't like to talk about it, but every so often, people see a convoy of trucks along Route 666. Not real trucks, ghost trucks. They say it's the drivers who crashed along this highway, some years back. All of them dead, but they still drive, stuck in a loop, reliving their last journey." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "You're saying those trucks weren't real? That I saw, ghosts?" She nodded slowly. "A lot of drivers see them. Some say they're there to warn you, like a bad omen. They show up when something's about to go wrong, like they're trying to protect you from meeting the same fate." I sat back, the reality of what she was saying sinking in. I hadn't just imagined it. I hadn't just been tired. I had seen something that defied all logic, something that had no place in the real world. As I left the diner and got back into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much darker, something far more dangerous than I could ever understand. The road stretched ahead of me, silent and empty, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop wondering, had those ghostly truckers been trying to warn me? And if so, what had I narrowly avoided? I never drove that stretch of Route 491 again after dark. Some roads just carry a weight you can't explain, and the old Route 666. That's one of them. Maybe they changed the name, but the spirits of that road still linger, waiting for the next driver to cross their path. The Hitchhiker with No Face. Location, U.S. Highway 101, Oregon coast. I've been trucking long enough to know when the road's trying to play tricks on you. I've hauled freight across almost every state, and I've seen my fair share of strange things, from UFO sightings in Nevada to a guy running across the highway in nothing but a pair of cowboy boots in Texas. But the Oregon coast? That stretch along U.S. Highway 101, man, it's got a reputation, and now I know why. I wasn't even supposed to be on 101 that day. I usually stick to the interstates, but my dispatcher had sent me down to the coast for a rush delivery. I wasn't complaining, though. The Pacific Ocean views are stunning, and it beats the endless flat roads through Kansas, that's for sure. It had been raining for hours, the kind of rain that turns the road into a mirror. I was making decent time, but I was tired, and my back was aching like a son of a gun. I'd been driving since I was 19, and back then, I could pull all-nighters like they were nothing. But now, pushing 45, with a gut that was more burgers than muscle, I didn't bounce back like I used to. Still, the open road was where I felt at home. Plus, trucking gave me plenty of stories to tell, like the time I outran a tornado in Oklahoma or that one Christmas when I accidentally parked my rig in front of a Santa parade in some tiny Colorado town. Anyway, I was cruising along the coast, the rain pounding against the windshield, when I saw him. A hitchhiker, just standing there in the rain, soaked to the bone. Normally, I wouldn't have given him a second thought, company policy and all that about picking up strangers, but something about him made me slow down. He was just standing there, his hoodie pulled tight over his head, hands in his pockets, looking like he'd been through hell and back. Now, here's the thing, I'm not exactly the Good Samaritan type. Sure, I'll hold the door open for someone or help a buddy move if he offers free beer, but I don't make a habit of picking up hitchhikers. Especially not in the middle of a storm. But for some reason, I found myself pulling over. He didn't say a word when he got in. Just nodded once and slumped into the passenger seat, dripping all over my upholstery. I glanced over at him, couldn't see much with that hood pulled down low over his face, but he looked young, maybe early 20s. I figured he was probably one of those free-spirited, hitchhiking types who thought he was living the simple life, by wandering around with no job, no responsibilities. You know the type. As we started rolling again, I tried to strike up a conversation. Hell of a storm out there, I said, my voice louder than it needed to be over the sound of the rain. Nothing. Not a grunt, not a nod, just silence. I shrugged it off, figuring he was either shy or just plain weird. We drove for a while, the windshield wipers working overtime as the rain kept pounding down. The ocean was just to our left, the waves crashing against the cliffs. Normally, it's a beautiful sight, but that day, it looked angry, like the sea was about to swallow the road whole. A few more miles down the road, I glanced over at him again, trying to make small talk. So, where you headed, buddy? Still nothing. I started feeling a little uneasy. It wasn't like I was expecting a full-blown conversation, but the guy wasn't even acknowledging my existence. That's when I noticed something off. I don't know if it was the way the light from the dashboard hit him or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I swear, for a second, it looked like he didn't have a face. Just smooth skin, like someone had erased his features with a giant eraser. I blinked, shook my head. You're tired, man, I muttered to myself. You've been driving too long. But when I looked back at him, he still didn't have a face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank, featureless canvas where his face should have been. I'm not proud to admit it, but I screamed. Not a little yelp either, a full-on, high-pitched scream that I hadn't let loose since I was a kid watching Jaws for the first time. I swerved the truck, nearly sending us both over the cliff into the ocean. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I thought it'd burst. I slammed on the brakes and turned toward him, ready to demand answers, or maybe just throw him out of the cab altogether, but when I looked, the seat was empty. No hitchhiker. No faceless man. Just a soaking wet passenger seat. I jumped out of the truck, rain still pouring down, and looked around. There was no sign of him. He'd vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. Now, you might think that's where the story ends, but no. Here's the kicker. A few days later, I stopped at a diner up in Coos Bay, not too far from where I'd picked up my faceless friend. I was telling the waitress about the whole thing, half joking, half serious, you know, trying to make light of it. She got real quiet, real fast. Then she leaned in and said, "You picked up the hitchhiker with no face, didn't you?" Turns out, the legend's been around for decades. Local truckers, people passing through, they've all seen him. Some say he's the ghost of a man who died in a car crash back in the 70s, others say he's something else, something older, tied to the sea and the cliffs. No one really knows. But what they do know is that if you pick him up, you don't ever see his face until it's too late. I don't know what to believe. Maybe I was just overtired, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I've driven that stretch of 101 plenty of times since, and every time it rains, I keep my eyes peeled for him. And let me tell you, I'm not pulling over again. So, if you ever find yourself on that road, and you see a guy in a hoodie standing in the rain, keep driving. Trust me, you don't want to find out what he's hiding under that hood. And hey, on the bright side, at least I've got one hell of a story for the next truck stop poker night. The woman at the gas station. I've been driving trucks for close to 2 decades now, but I wasn't always a trucker. I used to work in a small auto shop in a town you've never heard of, nestled in the hills of southern Ohio. I liked the work, the routine of it, fixing engines, rotating tires, getting my hands greasy. But when the shop closed down after the owner passed, I found myself out of work, with a family to support. That's when I got into trucking. At first, it was just a job, but over time, it became my life. The long stretches of highway, the solitude, they gave me a sense of peace I didn't realize I needed. I'm no stranger to lonely roads and late-night drives, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the highway has a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially at night. But what happened to me on I-80, near Wendover, Nevada, was something else entirely. It had been a long haul, driving all the way from Salt Lake City, and I was pushing through to get my load to Reno by the morning. I had just crossed the Nevada state line, the lights of Wendover fading in my rearview mirror, when I decided to pull over at a small, out-of-the-way gas station. I'd passed through this stretch of I-80 a few times, but I'd never stopped here before. The place looked ancient, like it had been there since the highway was built and had never been updated. The lights flickered weakly above the pumps, casting long shadows that stretched out into the desert. I pulled up, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cool desert air. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that only exists in places far from civilization. The station looked like it hadn't seen a customer in days, dust coated the windows, and the old payphone by the door hung crooked, its cord frayed. But I needed to fill up, and more importantly, I needed coffee. The kind that tastes like burnt rubber but at least keeps you awake. As I filled the tank, I looked around. There was only one other vehicle, a beat-up old sedan parked off to the side, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't think much of it. The desert attracts all kinds of people, especially in a place like this. After finishing up, I headed inside to grab my coffee. The interior was just as run down as the outside. Shelves half empty, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. There was an old woman behind the counter, her skin leathery from years under the Nevada sun. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, I saw her, sitting alone in the corner of the store, half in shadow. She was wearing a faded, tattered sundress, something that looked like it belonged in a different era, and her hair was wild, unkempt, like she hadn't brushed it in days. But what struck me the most were her eyes, wide and staring, fixed right on me. She didn't blink, didn't look away. It wasn't the kind of stare that people give you when they're trying to make conversation, it was vacant, almost desperate. I tried to ignore her as I made my way to the counter, the coffee steaming in my hand. But as I was paying, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me. I could feel her eyes boring into my back. The cashier handed me my change, and I turned to leave, but that's when I noticed something strange. She was no longer sitting in the corner. She was standing outside, right by the door, staring at me through the glass. I paused, feeling a chill run down my spine. I've seen my share of hitchhikers in my time on the road, but something about this woman, she didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way she moved, so silently, or maybe it was the fact that she'd gone from sitting to standing in the blink of an eye, like she had floated across the room. As I stepped outside, she spoke. "Need a ride?" Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, I'm good. I'm not going far." She just stood there, staring at me, her eyes wide and glassy, like she didn't quite understand. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. About 30 miles down the road, the sky was pitch black, the desert stretching out in every direction like an endless void. My headlights were the only source of light, cutting through the darkness as I sped along the highway. I was trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in my chest, that weird encounter with the woman back at the gas station. It wasn't the first time I'd run into strange folks on the road, but this felt different. Then, out of habit, I glanced at my rearview mirror, and there she was. Sitting in the back seat of my cab. I nearly lost control of the wheel. My heart jumped into my throat, and I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt on the side of the highway. I whipped around, expecting to see her sitting there, staring at me with those dead eyes. But when I looked, the seat was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the hum of the truck's engine. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of what just happened. I knew I had seen her. She had been there, sitting in my truck, plain as day. But now, nothing. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just tired. Long hours on the road can mess with your head. But the image of her sitting in the back seat, staring at me, wouldn't leave my mind. I floored it to the next rest stop, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When I finally pulled over, I sat there in the parking lot for a while, the truck idling, trying to shake the feeling of dread that clung to me like a shadow. The next day, I mentioned the incident to another driver I met at a diner in Reno. He gave me a strange look, then nodded knowingly. "You stopped at that old gas station near Wendover, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, a few of us have seen her," he said, stirring his coffee. "The story goes that a woman was murdered at that station years ago, back when Route 80 was still new. Some trucker picked her up, gave her a ride, and, well, she never made it out of the desert." He leaned in a little closer. "Now, they say she haunts that stretch of highway, looking for another ride. Sometimes, she gets in your truck, but by the time you notice her, it's already too late." I left the diner that morning with a heavy feeling in my gut, the kind that doesn't go away no matter how hard you try to forget. I haven't driven that stretch of I-80 at night since. Some things on the road are better left alone, and that woman, whoever, or whatever, she was, is one of them. The Motel from Hell. I've been a trucker for over 15 years now, and let me tell you, you get used to seeing some weird stuff on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for that night outside Havre, Montana, on US Route 2. It was late, I was beat, and I just needed a place to crash for a few hours. But what I got was a night I'll never forget. Now, I'm not picky when it comes to motels. I don't need those fancy places with mini fridges and fluffy towels. Hell, I've slept in the back of my rig more times than I can count. But that night, the rain was coming down in sheets, and my back was killing me from a long haul. So, when I saw the flickering neon sign for a motel just off the road, I figured it would do. From the outside, the place looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since Nixon was in office. The parking lot had more potholes than pavement, and the vacancy sign blinked like it was running on its last breath. But I was too tired to care. I walked into the lobby, if you could call it that, and immediately knew I'd made a mistake. The air was thick with that musty, old carpet smell, like it hadn't been aired out in decades. Behind the counter sat a guy who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in just as long. He had a grizzled beard, mismatched glasses, and he barely looked up from his crossword puzzle when I approached. "Room?" he muttered, barely above a whisper, not even giving me a proper greeting. I nodded, trying to muster up some enthusiasm. "Yeah, just for the night." Without so much as a glance, he slid an old, worn key across the counter and mumbled, "Room 212. I swear, the key looked like it had been around longer than the building itself. The room wasn't any better. The wallpaper was peeling, the bed looked like it had seen more action than an old dive bar, and there was a faint smell of, well, I didn't want to know. But the kicker? The light overhead flickered like a haunted house special effect. At that point, though, I didn't care. I was bone-tired. I collapsed onto the bed, without even pulling back the sheets, mind you, and fell asleep in record time. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. Knock knock knock. I jolted awake, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I was in that hazy half-awake, half-asleep state where you can't tell what's real and what's a dream. But then it happened again, knock knock knock, louder this time, like whoever was out there was getting impatient. I groggily swung my legs out of bed and shuffled over to the door, feeling like I'd been hit by a freight train. I looked through the peephole, squinting, expecting to see some drunk guy who'd knocked on the wrong door. But there was no one. I shrugged it off, figured maybe it was just some kids messing around or the wind. I crawled back into bed, pulled the pillow over my head, and tried to go back to sleep. Then came the bang. Not just a knock, mind you, a full-blown bang, like someone had thrown their body against the door. I shot up in bed, adrenaline kicking in hard now. I grabbed the lamp off the nightstand, because, you know, when you're scared out of your mind, a lamp makes a great weapon, right, and crept toward the door. My heart was thumping so loud I thought it'd jump right out of my chest. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out into the dimly lit hallway. Nothing. The corridor was completely empty, not a soul in sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel that creeping sensation of being watched. Now, I don't scare easy. I've been through my fair share of rough situations, dodging tornadoes, dealing with unruly passengers back when I used to drive cabs, but this? This was different. Something didn't feel right. I quickly grabbed my duffel bag, threw my stuff together faster than you could say, haunted motel, and hightailed it to the front desk. The clerk, still working on that same crossword puzzle, looked up with barely a flicker of interest. "I'm checking out," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "Room 212. At that, his expression changed. The lazy indifference in his eyes shifted to something darker. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and said, almost too casually, "You said room 212. I nodded, gripping my duffel a little tighter. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "That room's been empty since '89. I blinked. "What do you mean, empty?" "I just slept there." The old man gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "No one stayed in that room since a trucker, fellow like yourself, checked in and, well, didn't check out." "Didn't check out?" I asked, though I already knew where this was going. I could feel the air in the room grow heavy, like someone had just opened a door to the past. "Died in there. Hung himself, they say. His rig broke down, he lost his load, and, well, you know how the road can get to a man. Ever since, folks say they hear knocking at all hours. Some even say they see him standing in the hall. Now, normally, I'd call BS on a story like that. I'd laugh it off, chalk it up to some local legend the guy was peddling for kicks. But after what I'd heard, and felt, I wasn't laughing. My grip on the duffel tightened, and I gave the old man a quick nod before I bolted out of there. As I climbed back into my rig, I couldn't help but let out a nervous chuckle. It wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from something funny, more like the kind that bubbles up when you don't know what else to do. The rain had stopped, the sky just starting to lighten with the coming dawn. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of that parking lot like I was fleeing from the gates of hell itself. As I merged back onto Route 2, the absurdity of it all hit me. Here I was, a grown man, a seasoned trucker, scared out of my wits by some ghost story. I let out a loud laugh, this time a real one, feeling the tension ease out of my shoulders. Maybe it was just a bad dream, maybe it was the weird vibe of that crummy motel getting to me. Who knows? But one thing's for sure, I'm never staying in room 212 again. And from now on, when someone asks if I have any good stories from the road, I've got a real winner to share over a couple of beers. It's not every day you check out of the motel from hell and live to tell the tale. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your time and engagement mean the world to me. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support keeps this channel going, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you.